I'm Danielle Gagne, Commercial UAV News Editorial Analyst, and today I'm excited to be moderating our Ask the Expert Remote ID panel. We have a lot to go over today to get through our readers' questions, so I'm going to jump right in and ask our panel to introduce themselves and let us know what is the top question or questions you've been fielding since the drone rule came out. I'm going to start with Brian.
Hey, how you doing? Appreciate it, Danielle, and I appreciate being on the panel here. I'm humbled. Again, my name is Brian Mckernan, and I'm the chairman of the NATE UAS subcommittee for all of wireless. I'm also the chief revenue officer for a company called Consortic. We're a global consultancy, training, and service company. So some of the biggest questions that we've seen in the wireless community regarding or relating to remote ID is, when do we have to be compliant? And we know that's in the rule, but will that rule change due to the new administration and some of the restrictions they've put out? That's a big question. The second one is, will DGI be compliant? And the third is, will Trump's executive order on UAS be abandoned or adhered to?
All major questions. I hope some of those we'll dig in today. David, can we go with you next?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, of course, for having me on the panel, and I'm happy to be joining the team and crew that we have here today. I am David Benowitz, the head of research at DroneAnalyst. DroneAnalyst is an independent research and consultancy firm focused on the commercial drone industry since 2016. And I've been mostly talking to a lot of clients and customers, just really focusing on the timeline of the rollout itself, which has been what the majority of questions have been about.
Fantastic. And hopefully we'll be able to get some information about that from Mike. Mike, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Mike O'Shea. I'm a program manager with the Federal Aviation Administration in the Office of Unmanned Aircraft Systems Integration. I've been with the FAA now for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was with the Department of Justice for 17 years in the Office of Science and Technology. And I've been around for a while with UAS. We started doing UAS back in 2003. I sat on the 107 ARC, and I sat on the remote ID ARC as well.
Fantastic. It's an honor to have you here today. Brendan, can we move on to you? Can you introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you for having me, Danielle. It's good to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces. So it's good to be with you all again. So my name is Brendan Stewart. I'm the director of training at DroneUp. DroneUp is a global drone services company. And my role in the company and what I spend the majority of my time on is helping to enable some of the advanced operations that we're doing for delivery, flight over people, that sort of thing. So this is very much in my lane, and I'm excited to talk about it. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Greg, last but not least, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Greg Riverdio here, representing Pilot Institute. I'm the lead instructor, and I'm the co-owner of Pilot Institute. We train people to fly airplanes and fly drones. So we have 60,000 students in our system right now. And we've been doing this for a while. I've been a flight instructor for almost 20 years now, and then added the remote pilot stuff when it came around the corner. I've been flying since the first DJI drones were out there. So I've had a passion for drones for a long time, and I appreciate being on this panel with all these people that know a whole lot of stuff about drones, which is really amazing. The questions we get all the time is it's been very similar to what Brian just said. Will my drone be compliant? Is my DJI XX going to be compliant with remote ID? And then also, with the new regulation for flying over people. So is my drone going to be a category 1, 2, 3, or 4? And obviously we don't have the answers to that at the moment. And then the next one was really how to get current. I couldn't just keep it to one question because we've been fielding so many questions. How do I get current again now with a new regulation? So I think over time people will get it, but we'll have some really good discussions about this.
I'm looking forward to that discussion, and I'm going to dive right in, calling on you first, David. One of the submissions was about industry outlook. And so the question that was asked was, once the new remote ID rules are put into place, how do you think it's going to impact adoption and existing drone programs?
Yeah, I mean, the great work that was done at the FAA by Mike and his colleagues have really made this question a lot easier to answer than I expected it would be. The simplicity of the broadcast requirement and just the timeline of it being 32 months from publish date or 60 days after publish date means that I don't see any real impact or negative impact from this rule coming in place. Once remote ID goes into place, the FAA will be able to move on to future regulations, and drone programs will be able to consider other things. But just the cost of actually becoming compliant, I expect to be incredibly low. The cost for manufacturers to move over to the new requirement is also going to be incredibly low, as we've seen from their NPRM comments and future current statements or recent statements from manufacturers. So overall, not too much impact, and kind of sets the path for better rules and more pathways for the industry to come.
And Brendan, do you have anything to add to that? What are you seeing at DroneUp?
Yeah, I do. And I'm really with David on this one. I think the implementation of these new rules are not only going to be relatively easy, especially on the remote ID side, to implement as drone programs move along. But I believe some of the changes with regard to night operations and overflight of people are going to foster the development of some drone programs where the compliance costs have been too high in the past to implement. Many of our clients at DroneUp come to us with concerns about being able to fly over people. We've helped a number of clients develop waivers for that. And in the past, that had been a Herculean lift that a lot of companies that didn't have the resources to do all the testing that was required, to do all the development of internal policies and procedures that was required to mitigate human factors of some of these earlier systems. Because that's becoming standardized under the rule, we hope to see the adoption become easier for a lot of these more advanced operations. And then, of course, moving into remote ID, that opens up the door for UTM, BVLOS, using remote ID as the basis or the beginning of a potential deconfliction architecture in the future. So I'm excited about what I'm seeing here. The implementation period is not so aggressive that it's going to make it hard for drone programs to adopt, and appreciative of all the work that Mike and his team at the FAA have put into making this happen.
Thanks, Brendan. And Brian, Brendan kind of touched on industry. What are you seeing? How is the industry kind of looking at these newest rules? Is it an enabler? And what challenge do you think the industry may run into, and how can we mitigate those challenges?
Yeah, I definitely think it's an enabler for everyone who works in the telecoms industry who uses drones. As it relates to flight ops over people, this has been a significant factor affecting those flying around vertical infrastructure, towers, if you will. There's a lot of towers that are located in isolated areas, but many are located in urban or suburban areas that inevitably are more populated. So this rule, will enable folks in our industry to decrease, not eliminate, the approval and process time to fly. In addition, 5G antennas are being installed in urban corridors and rooftops, densely populated areas, which is yet another reason why flights over people flexibility in the new rule is very important for our industry. So I echo what the others have already said, and thank the FAA for this one. It's a big deal. The remote ID rule in particular, that substantially promotes safety in the NAS. We all know that, for infrastructure, for the public, those traveling by air, as well as those on the ground. Many companies, especially contractor firms in telecoms who utilize drones, use small UAS that are most often DJI. So what will the remote ID rule impact be on them? Well, those who are operating, they really have two choices. They either need to upgrade their equipment, or they need to purchase that broadcast module to be affixed to their aircraft. Then the next question is, do I start now, or do I wait until the rule is mandatory, 30 months from now? Or do I wait until a few months before the deadline? From my perspective, either way, I would wait a period of time to see what the OEMs are going to come out with and what they're going to produce.
Good advice. Just the more opportunities you have to see what's out there, the better you can select what's actually going to work for your company. Mike, you've been getting a lot of accolades over there for the FAA. What is the time window for implementation for RID, night flight certification of flights over people? And will this impact commercial pilots and hobbyists differently? We got that question from several different angles.
So first of all, thanks for all the accolades. I wish I could take credit for all the good stuff the FAA does, but other people were obviously involved and did a lot of the hard work. I just get to speak about it. And I almost feel like saying what they said, in terms of, my answers to everything. The FAA is great for, it's not what we hear all the time. So it's great to hear that. And listening to some of the comments here, it's going to impact both, all operators sort of equally in terms of remote ID. They just have different ways they can operate. And as you already probably know, there's three different ways. There's standard ID, which is sort of the firmware on the drone actually broadcasts, both the location of the drone and also the location of the remote controller. And then you have the broadcast module that basically broadcasts wherever that module's at. And then you have what we call the FRIA, or the FAA recognized identification zones, which are really set up for the recreational users to have sort of an area where they can fly their drones, but not have to comply with the rule. And so they all hit equally. We're crossing our fingers right now. All federal rules have been frozen. So, we're waiting to get confirmation that the new administration will allow us to continue with the dates as we've posted. So that's still, we're still waiting for that. But if they all do happen, obviously the operating dates is September 16th, 2023 is when you're supposed to be compliant. The rule actually published January 15th. The final rule takes effect March 16th. The online training is supposed to be available 45 days after the rule, which will be March 1st. And that'll give you the ability to be recurrent, and it sort of starts the clock again on how long your license is good for, 2 years. The only thing it doesn't do is you'll get night training as part of that, but the night training won't take effect, or you won't be able to exercise the privilege until the rule actually takes effect, which is 60 days after. So even though you take the training online and can be recurrent right then, you can't exercise the night privileges unless you already have an existing waiver until March 16th, which is when the rule takes effect. The manufacturer compliance date is the 22nd. When you build a new drone, you're going to have this firmware built, September 16, 2022. You'll have to have this firmware involved. And then some of the issues that people already brought up is we had a lot of concerns from people about, oh my gosh, if this has to be connected to the internet, then what happens when I'm doing operations, we're in urban canyons, or what happens when I'm doing operations in very rural, remote areas? How can I comply with the rule? So that was one of the factors that changed the rule. So that now all you really need is you're just broadcasting either on Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, and you're picking it up with any kind of device that can receive Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and you don't have to be connected to the internet. You don't have to be connected to a cellular connection. It works pretty well. And the other issue was obviously the cost. People said, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to go out and buy a new drone. Well, I'm telling my wife that I have to go buy a new drone. So please don't tell her otherwise. But in reality, we've talked to a lot of the manufacturers, and many of them believe they can download firmware on their existing platforms that they support to actually be compliant with the broadcast, the standard broadcast of part of the rule. We actually and just to let you know, and we were, you write these rules, but you're always wondering, do they actually work? How effectively do they work? So we had a task, during COVID, to go down to Quantico, Virginia, and for a week, look at some existing technologies and see if we could actually do remote ID with them. And it's one of those things where we were so worried that it wouldn't work that we were in my backyard actually practicing first to make sure that it would work, because we were going to demonstrate this to a lot of major partners, and it worked seamlessly. I mean, flawlessly. I mean, I was like, it impressed all of us. The Bluetooth worked really well, both 4 and 5. Picking up with your phone, and we were using some simple programs that people had developed, and we were getting pretty good range. I mean, up to 2 kilometers with Bluetooth 4, which is pretty good. The Wi-Fi that we worked with was amazing. The manufacturer provided that so they could actually pick up an aircraft up to 13 miles away, which, our minimum performance standard for this rule is if you can see it, you should be able to ID it. But the ability, it kind of boggles the mind what you could do with a device that, is Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, not a cell phone, but something designed specifically to receive those. You could put those around a building, a facility, and actually use it as sort of a detection system to ID the drones that are out there and flying over your facilities, whatever. I mean, it sort of boggles the mind what you could do with this. So we're pretty excited to see what industry is going to do.
That's really exciting news, and a lot more than what I knew about the capability. So thank you for being on the panel and sharing that with our audience. Greg, I'd like to follow on that question. And in light of all this information, how will this implementation of these new rules affect how pilots should be trained?
It's a really good question. And I think about this and I think about the challenges that we're going to be faced with. And the first one is the amount of data that is available out there at the moment that cannot be modified. And then when I say data, I'm talking about videos for training. If you go on YouTube, you can pull videos from several years ago that are not obsolete, but that can no longer be modified. And trying to prevent people from going to these videos that are no longer appropriate for the amount of training that we need to get, that's going to be difficult. I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. We're going to get a lot of people trained on the old regulation when they need to be trained on the new regulation. And that's always somewhat of a complaint I had with learning with YouTube, is that the data is there, you can never change it. YouTube doesn't allow you to modify videos. So and then on top of it, obviously, and this is something that we deal with on a regular basis, is people coming to us that have learned something wrong somewhere else and have to relearn. And there's the law of primacy, where you learn something the first time is something that you're going to remember. And so this is something that we have to deal with. And I think the challenge that we're going to be faced with is getting to people. And I know this is something the FAA, and I'm sure Mike can say yes to this, is getting to people to give them the information. This is very difficult. People that are already trained, how do we have them come back? Now, with the new training that the FAA is putting in place for free on their website, this is great, because this is the ability to bring people back. This is something that we've seen with the WINGS program for many aircraft. And I know the FAA is working on something similar where we can retrain people and give them the updates. This industry is changing, and it's going to keep changing. Every couple of years, we'll get new regulation. How do we keep those people trained is going to be a big challenge. So this is something that we've done on our side. We have a large database of people that we can talk to on a regular basis by sending emails, by updating our courses. I went through, I spent days and days in my office just updating the course for the new regulation. So as of the end of January, we had the new regulation in place for people to learn. But this is something that I think the FAA needs to be also aware of, in a way, is that us as training providers, we need to have the ability to provide that information to our customers so that they can be trained and be ready to go. And I tell you, this is a rush, because now we're a month away from the new exam, and I know a lot of schools don't have their course updated just yet. So this is something that maybe Mike, something you can pass down to other people is help the teachers, help the people that teach, and not only us, obviously everybody else across the industry to be able to get that information across. So, but yeah, in terms of training people, we'll keep doing what we're doing, but we're going to be faced with new challenges, I think, because of this new regulation. It's exciting. I'm excited that the FAA went through all of these changes and provided and listened to what people had to say, and I think this is a change for the positive. So we'll keep trucking along.
Thank you, Greg. Brendan, you have anything to add? How are you approaching training and getting your pilots up to speed?
Yeah, I think there are two 2 points to this, and one to follow on Greg's thesis is, those of us who fly airplanes know how the advisory circular system works, right? So we know how to go up and educate ourselves on the new regulations. We know the traditional mechanisms that the FAA uses for that. The UAS community is now so large, and the rules are changing so quickly. There's not a efficient, centralized way of disseminating that information in a manner that is ensured to be authoritative. I mean, Greg made a great point about YouTube. There are so many videos on YouTube about what is legal, what's not legal, what's within the regulations. I've seen some things, talked about, like, oh, you don't have to worry about flying over people because you can make everybody a visual observer. I'm sure Mike would tell you that's probably not the case, right? So authoritative sources are important, but we also need to look at a mechanism for disseminating that information effectively. Greg, you made a really good point about forming some sort of partnership with the FAA, where the FAA supports training institutions to provide that. I mean, there's no such thing as a CFIU, like there is a CFI for manned aircraft, or a CFI for gliders, or anything else like that, right? So authoritative sources are important. Making sure that data is getting out there effectively and getting out there accurately is extremely important, to make sure that people can be compliant with these new regulations, especially because the implementation period for overflight of people in night operations is pretty short. These rules are going to be effective in March, which is when the flying season's beginning for a lot of the northern latitude areas. So making sure that that's out there is important. Second, I'm a big believer that just because a particular type of training is not required, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a good idea anymore. One of the big changes that we're seeing with overflight of people is a lot of the overflight of people waivers that have been approved. In fact, every one that I'm familiar with that's been approved has a training component in some capacity or another. What we do at DroneUp for our waivers, we have a knowledge-based training component and a practical training component. We actually take the pilots out, have them do a check ride in configuration before they're signed off to fly that configuration of drone and parachute. We're a big believer in human factors mitigation. We know that 80% of aviation accidents are caused by human factors. And what we've found is the majority of accidents that are being reported associated with parachutes deploying when they shouldn't or failing to deploy is not necessarily a technical failure of the system itself, because these all meet the ASTM standard and the ones that have been approved under waiver, but it's that they've been configured or calibrated or set up improperly or inspected improperly, right? So from what I can tell from the NPRM in categories 2 and 3, there's not a definite requirement for training on the particular platforms that are going to meet that means of compliance through impact data. But we feel strongly that there should be still, and maybe this comes from the manufacturer, but a requirement that before a system is declared compliant, that the operator who's responsible for operating that system has ensured that their flight crews are appropriately qualified in the use of that system. Because as we know, on any drone that's not type certificated, it's only as airworthy as it is configured and inspected to be, and that goes for the parachutes too. And we see a higher level of risk there, especially because when you're operating over people, there's greater ground risk than there typically is in a 107 operation. So even though that's not necessarily required, it's something that if an organization was building a drone program in the new rules that allow flight over people, that's one of the things that I would strongly recommend is instituting a robust human factors mitigation program, which would include training, among other things.
Excellent advice. Brian, I'd like to go to you, and businesses are going to have to adjust to these new rules, and as they look to do operations over people, how should they be preparing for this, especially in terms of that training?
Yeah, it's a great question. Starting off, the telecoms industry is the fastest growing space outside of energy, utilities, oil, where drones are being most widely adopted and used. I mean, every day we see more of the larger engineering firms, tower companies moving toward using drones in at least one or more ways in regular business as a usual activity. With regard to preparation, I would say never underestimate the critical importance of knowledge and preparation. Simply put, know what the rules are. Training is critical. Greg and Brendan just spoke about it, and clearly that's close to our heart with my company. And Mike even, spoke about it earlier. What does that mean? Well, they went out and they tested the kit to make sure that remote ID worked, and it worked flawlessly. You should be doing that as well once you get up and running. One of the biggest things in terms of preparation as well is, as I reiterated before, I would give the rules some time. The OEMs are spooling up right now to make sure that they're adhering to the rules. They're probably building out, whether it's firmware or just creating brand new aircraft already that's enabled to enable this rule. In addition, Mike had already brought it up, we're in a regulatory freeze right now, which basically means that we don't know if the remote ID, the ops over people and the night ops is even gonna, is it gonna be affected or not? Nobody knows. So back to my original point, I would give it some time, and that's up to the individual to see where everything shakes out before you go and purchase. And one last extra point too is, everybody that's in industry and using aircraft daily outside of training and outside of OEMs, this rule just came out on 28 December. Everyone knew it was coming, but didn't quite know exactly what was going to be in it. Did you budget for it? Did you budget for it in 2021? Is that in your plan to either buy those new aircraft or get the modules to a fix or whatever that looks like? If not, you probably want to start doing that for 2022 once the rules are fully in effect. So those are some points I would add.
Excellent and practical points. Thank you, Brian. Brendan, kind of going this conversation about getting prepared for training. So for those who have already had night flight training, because DroneUp and other companies like Sundance Media Group have created these programs, do they still need to take the FAA's training to get their certificate?
So from what we understand, the short answer is yes, once the rule is implemented. And Mike, if I'm out of turn here, feel free to back me up. But what the rule stipulates is 60 days after the rule is implemented, the night waivers that those individuals or those organizations would be operating under are going to become ineffective. So you 60 days after that rule is implemented to become compliant. You can continue flying under your night waiver until then. Get the night training from the FAA, take your recurrent test. There's going to be that online portal that allows you to do that. Once the rule is fully implemented, that'll allow you to smoothly transition from your night waiver over to the new rule. There is an additional layer that I would recommend here. There are a couple of organizations, Sundance is one that I'll give a shout out to. We do this as well, but we also offer a practical night training component. I believe that there's a very significant need for actually getting some experience flying at night before you fly at night for the first time. In the Part 61 community, in the manned aviation community, we have specific minimums for how many times you need to take off and land at night to stay current over a long period of time, because it is entirely a different thing to read about those visual illusions and read about the scanning pattern you're supposed to perform and the off-center viewing and other mitigations you might use, and to actually implement those in a real world operation and experience what that's like, right? Get that down to the point where it's muscle memory and you no longer have to think about it. So for those that are putting together enterprise drone programs, or if you have an enterprise drone program today, the transition is going to be relatively seamless for you. You're going to take that online training that the FAA provides. You're going to wait that 60-day period, continue flying at night for that 60-day period that your night waiver is effective. And then when that night waiver is rescinded, the operations under the rule will be effective around that same date. So you should be able to make a seamless transition. However, if you are doing practical training as a part of your night training program, even though it won't be required in the future, I strongly recommend it as a risk mitigation tactic, and also to get your pilots up to speed and a little bit more effective, a little bit faster.
Excellent point and great advice. Mike, since we are on the topic of night flights, will LAANC be compatible with night flying hours? And if it's not immediately compatible, how do flyers get that approval or provide notice to the towers besides calling the FAA to get that night flying near their airspace?
So it will not be immediately available. It will actually hopefully be available sometime early fall, late summer. We're trying to speed up the process because we realize it's a huge issue. And I think there was some assumption on some people's parts that they could just flip a switch and it would make it, you could do LAANC authorizations at night, but that's not the case. There's a lot of software that has to be changed. And then they have to obviously test it and do all the other stuff that goes along with, software development. So, they've tried to expedite it as much as possible. Meanwhile, you're going to be able to file a night authorization in the drone zone. And there's been some talk about what that means and how we can expedite that even quicker. And basically, I would just say at this point, just stay tuned because it's coming, but it's not, the final plans haven't been developed yet.
We look forward to seeing all of that come together. And although the best resource is to read the rule itself, and you've done a little bit of this already, can you provide a high-level overview of what pilots and businesses will need to keep in mind when preparing for the remote ID rule to come into place?
For the remote ID rule, is the bottom line is to remember you have to be compliant by the September 16th, 2023. And then and it really depends on what that means. You may have a vendor that downloads firmware to your drone that makes you broadcast compliant, standard broadcast compliant, or you have to go out and buy a broadcast module. And we did sort of do an economic impact of what we thought that would cost, and basically said it would probably cost around $50. But I don't want to say I can guarantee you, but I bet you it'll be less. Because it's really not a sophisticated thing, really. And it's just a matter of how you attach it and stuff. And then obviously the manufacturers know they need to be compliant by September 16, 2022. So any drone that's purchased after that date needs to meet the standard broadcast rule. In other words, it has to have the firmware in it that broadcasts either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, or whatever means is going to be compliant with that'll meet the rule. But and then it also broadcast from the remote controller as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. David, we've kept you quiet for a while, so I'd like to bring you back on. A lot has been said in term about the concern for privacy, and a lot of the comments are centered on this topic. The concern comes from pilots themselves, who fear that if the general public is able to determine where the pilot is located, this might interfere with missions, the safety of the drone, and of themselves. This is also expressed by companies like Wing during the initial commenting period in a pretty big way. But can we discuss just a little bit about privacy and who will be able to access the information transmitted by broadcast remote ID and whether or not this does put pilots at risk? Would network have been any different?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So kind of to start with the last point around would network be very different. There are kind of two ways that the FAA could have approached this. One is with a network remote ID solution, which is essentially every drone has some type of 3G, 4G, LTE chip inside of it, and is sending its location data and other key aircraft data to a cloud service provider, and then you're able to access that through some browser means to see where all the drones are in my area. The issue with that is obviously potentially this data could be scraped, so you could very easily get all of this data around operations all over the United States, not just locally to you. So that might help people who are looking for competitive intelligence, but it's not necessarily securing your privacy in any meaningful way. There's maybe some ways you could have hidden some key aspects from certain users, but that's kind of going into the weeds. For the broadcast remote ID solution, which is what the FAA is moving towards, users can essentially, as Mike said earlier, pretty much as long as you can see the drone, you're able to access these data points, which are around the drone's position, its kind of direction as well, its flight path, but then also the pilot's position, and then the code that kind of ties back to the FAA. So they're not able to see, for example, your name, your email, your phone number, et cetera, but they are able to potentially find you, find where you're operating, and begin a conversation if there's an issue. I do kind of see that a lot of pilots, they feel personally that this could be putting them at risk in areas where people are very much, see drones as evil technology, which unfortunately there's still people with this type of mindset. What I would just say to that is that, I kind of see this as leveling the playing field when it comes down to privacy and just having two-sided information there. If you can see the drone, you should also be able to potentially begin a conversation with the operator. An operator should also be considering, how do I mark that I am an active pilot? If I'm a public safety officer, for example, I should be carrying some type of vest that identifies me as such, and also identifies me as the operator of the aircraft, so people can start connecting the two. Similar, if you're working utilities, or even if you're a pilot for fun, just have a cheery attitude about it, and be willing to identify kind of what you're doing at all times. And we still altogether as an industry have to work against a lot of these concerns about the technology, not necessarily about what you're doing itself.
Yeah, there's a couple other points that probably need to be made there. One is you got to consider that 95% plus of all flights are supposed to be conducted within visual line of sight. So if you can see the drone, you should be able to see the operator, whether you have this or not. So that shouldn't be an issue. The second thing is, the only information this is going to get is the serial number from that drone. It doesn't get the registration number. It doesn't get anything that's personally identifiable to the operator of that drone. And then for people like, public safety who want to, strangle the RID squawk or whatever, the solution we've come up with is what we call session ID. And session ID is essentially the ability to sort of computer generate a number that becomes your serial number for that flight. So every time you fly, you can change the number, and then only the FAA or public safety can interrogate that and actually say, ABC 123 is actually Mike O'Shea's drone. And then we've had the concerns about, it was one of the major comments we got with the comments on the rule about, will I be hassled more by other people? Will I be hassled by public safety because I'm flying a drone? And so part of one of our efforts is actually do some better outreach and some, I don't want to call it training, but provide more information regarding about how you can be that safe drone operator. And I like what David said about wearing the vest and stuff. You know, what happens with public safety is we just don't go out looking for drone operators. And I'm coming from a public safety background. We usually get called, right? Somebody calls us and says, hey, there's a drone flying over my neighbor's house. Well, it could be a real estate agent. So, you know, the way you handle that is you wear that vest that says, I'm a UAS drone operator, but you also hang door flyers around the neighborhood that says, you know, hey, just so you know, the Acme Drone Company is going to be flying a drone over, you know, so-and-so's house, taking pictures for the Acme Realty Company, you know, which is good advertising both for the, you know, for the drone operator and for the real estate company. So it should be a very positive thing for them to do, you know, because if I saw that on my door and I saw someone fly a drone over my neighbor's house, I wouldn't call the police. I'd be like, I know what's going on. You know, I only call the police when I don't know what's going on. So, and the vest is obviously a big help too. And then we need to work more with public safety to let them know when they do approach somebody operating a drone, what action they can take to make sure they don't cause an unsafe issue in the airspace. So they shouldn't, you know, get in their face and go, you know, land the drone right now. We need to work on a way how we approach people, how we tell them, you know, hey, could you, at your earliest convenience, can you land the drone so we can, you know, check your registration, your paperwork, and that, and your remote pilot ID and all that kind of stuff. And what I would do if I, you know, this is Mike O'Shea, if I was out operating a drone, I would print out all my information on a sheet of paper, and I would tape it to my, you know, my box that I keep my drone in. So when public safety shows up, you know, they'll either see it or I can point to it. And basically that's all the information they need to know. Hey, this is Mike O'Shea, you know, this is his remote pilot ID number, you know, and a picture of it and all this information, you know, oh, this guy's legit. That's all really public safety wants to know, if what you're doing is a legit operation. If it's not, then that's something they have to deal with. But I really like what David said. I mean, I know that, you know, my wife makes, you know, she thinks the orange vest or the yellow vest are kind of dorky, but I think they're great. And I think, you know, it lets people know that, you know, you're doing something. You're not just out there flying willy-nilly. You're out there for, you know, a commercial purpose, and treating it seriously.
Those are all excellent points, and I really like the idea of doing public outreach because it also helps with the drone industry and kind of being transparent, and that helps us in so many other ways as well. I know I didn't have you slated for this one, Brian, but you know, what are you having your drone operators kind of do to identify themselves, or what do you encourage?
Yeah, it's a great question. Wasn't slated to answer, but I'd love to jump in. The vests are phenomenal. You know, I don't ever go out flying without my big obnoxious yellow Part 107 vest that says, and also says, please do not interrupt, I'm operating an aircraft. Cones is another great way to block off the area that you're flying with. And of course, having a visual observer. And then ultimately, you know, if you've got a 3-man crew, you can also have a crowd control person to be there. Mike put it perfectly. And don't take this wrong, if you look like you know what you're doing and you're doing it professionally and you look like a professional crew, then most people are going to adhere to the rules. It's no different than you driving down the road and the electric crew is out there and they've got a guy with a stop sign on one end and they're conducting single lane operations on a 2-lane highway. You follow what they do because they're doing the right thing. And I found that wearing the right PPE, making sure that you've got your vest and, you know, maybe your Part 107 card, I wear it right in my left breast pocket right there, along with my insurance card, company, so they have all of it. And again, when you've got a 2 or 3-man team, generally people don't interrupt. Some people are very interested, and I would definitely say that the space that I've been in here doing this about 4 or 5 years, they're becoming a lot more accepted for sure in the community. People are like, oh, cool. What are you doing? What are you using it for? But for the most part, if you don't act in a nefarious way and you act like a professional, I can't imagine public service or anybody would come and interrupt your operation if you're doing it properly. And it all gets back to education. That's what we teach. Make sure you've got the PPE. Make sure you've got the vest. Make sure you've done your ORM. Make sure you've conducted all the human factors. And the night flight is, gosh, it's even more imperative. I love that Brendan spoke about the the currency. I revert back to my Marine Corps days where we were getting ready to go out to the carrier, and my 88B Harriers had a 6-day window where they had to conduct functional carrier landings on a concrete pad. We only had 7 days for them to get 2 day bounces and night bounces on the ship, also getting underway. So the currency, like I said, in the military and manned flight and even unmanned, it's super strict. So it's so important that people get trained up and they practice and they constantly fly, because I always say flying goggles, which for us is flying at night, it's a perishable skill, man. You will lose it in a second. So you've got to stay all over it. But I'm happy that the FAA has moved in this direction. I just think people, they need a little training, rods and cones, night illusions, things of that nature. And once they get that, start practicing, it's like anything else, it takes practice, and then they'll be able to go out and employ it and, you know, operate in a sufficient manner. Sorry.
No, excellent points. And I'd like to now go to the trainers. Greg, can you talk about ways that you teach your pilots to be safe? And do you think that'll continue to be what you do in the future with the remote ID rule?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to play the devil's advocate because I hear it from our students, which is a different perspective. Now, I think one thing we forgot in this discussion is that remote ID applies to everyone, Part 107, and recreational flyers as well. And I think the vest is good for Part 107. We recommend using the vest, having the cones, having the visual observers, and all of that. I think when it comes to the recreational flyer, it's going to be a completely different attitude. And this is something that we need to keep in mind. They're not going to be wearing the vest. I can tell you that. They should, maybe, probably, but it's not going to happen in the real world. I think also the issue with the privacy is the fact that you can register a drone at 13, so you can fly a drone by yourself. I don't know if you would fly it by yourself at 13, but this puts the younger crowd on the map and being very visible. So I think this is a point we can't downplay when it comes to the privacy. And this is something that I've been critical of, and I was critical of it when the NPRM came out, and I've seen so many reports of people being harassed or drones getting shot at. And I'm sure, Mike, you see some of these reports coming across your desk. So the one thing that we don't want as a community is we don't want people to be, instead of shooting at the drone, is coming to harass people with guns, and that can get ugly very quickly. So I think that's from what I hear, from the feeling that I get from the community, that's the biggest concern, is not to get harassed by somebody coming to talk to you, is somebody who really is against drone, that thinks that you're spying on them, and now they have a gun in their pocket and they can become dangerous, especially if you have to focus on your flight and then suddenly somebody coming in to bother you when you're flying. So the way I looked at it is, this is the problem is the way that the broadcast information is going to be sent. It's going to be sent without really the ability to filter that data and to put different layers of access. And the FAA needs to have access to the pilot location, which I think makes sense. Law enforcement needs to have access to pilot location. So even if you create 2 levels of access, one for law enforcement, one for the FAA, and you remove the location of the pilot for the other folks, for the public, then you still have a layer in between where you have somebody who's working a forest fire and needs to go find the operator because they need to get them out of the way. And that may not be law enforcement. That may be a crew that's on the site that doesn't have the higher access level to the data. So my hope is that the industry will put their brain together and find a way to limit the data, but this might be utopia. I still don't believe that the public needs to have access to the location of the pilots. That's my personal belief. The silver lining is, for those of you that are concerned about access, flying at lower altitude, when you start to land, that signal is going to be much harder to pick up, especially if there are trees, if there are any kind of interference. It's going to make it harder for somebody to come find you, if that's what you're afraid of, and find the location of the drone when you land. And then I think over time, what we will see is people getting used to drones. And I know this was one of the reasons the FAA wanted to have remote ID out there, is so that drones don't become the new thing. Drone becomes something that you see flying up in the sky. Like Mike was saying, if you know that the drone is flying in the area, you're not going to pay attention twice to it. But I can tell you, we answer a lot of questions every day. We have a chat box available for people to talk to us. And just last night, somebody at 9 o'clock was on the chat box and saying there's somebody in my yard that's looking through my window with their drone. Whether or not it's true, this is something that we have to deal with as a drone industry. And the first thing that we tell them is call 911, call the FAA, report it. And they said, well, this person, and this is like something that I saw yesterday. They said, well, the law enforcement doesn't care. They didn't really take my complaint. That's the things that we hear. Again, whether it's true or not, this is something that we have to deal with as an industry. So there's a lot of education, and making drones more visible with remote ID is a good thing. People will realize that there may be more drones that are flying around than we think. I think a lot of people won't even know that they can use their little cell phone to go and look up that there's a drone flying around. That's also another, I guess, silver lining, if you want to call it that. The privacy issue with network, to answer your question, would it be better with network? I think, like David said, network brings in a whole lot of other issues. To me, the one issue is the cost. There may be a cost associated with joining the airspace. I firmly believe that the airspace access needs to remain free, and we may not have that. If you look at the NPRM initially, the way it was, there was going to be a paid plan. If you go to an AMA field, it's not free to fly there. You have to have some kind of membership. If you go to fly with remote ID that has network, you may have to pay someone to access the airspace. That takes away a lot of access for a lot of people. The younger generation may not have access to the drones to go fly and become pilots. We need people to become pilots. A lot of people become pilots because as kids, they went with grandpa or with their dad or their mom, and they went out flying their drone, and then they have this passion for aviation, and then they become pilots afterwards. So it's a whole ecosystem, and we need to make it as simple as we can to access the data. So I know I went off track a little bit, but Mike, one question that I may have for you is, you talk about public outreach for pilots. How about public outreach for the community and telling them that a drone pilot is a crew and they cannot be messed with? And I hope that there's some kind of campaign where we can, I know the regulation is not there yet. Is there a way to make a UAS pilot a crew and part of the regulation that protects them?
So right now, as you're probably aware, there's actually no rule that protects the pilot on the ground. I mean, all the rules that are written talk about crew on board. And so that they're looking to write a new rule, and they're either going to try to add it to a future rule. We do this all the time, kind of add something to the existing rule, or they may try to go to some kind of expedited rulemaking to do that, because we recognize that's an issue. There should be a way to do enforcement if you're harassing somebody who's operating a drone from the ground.
That's good. I like to hear that. And I just want to say one more thing before I hand it off to the next person. Network is not going anywhere. The network capability, the FAA is clear in the final ruling that we will see network again. This is one step where we're using broadcast only. Network will be something in place. So for those of you that are watching that think that we're done with network, we're not. And if you look at UTM and the concept of UTM, ConOps 2.0, it's an integral part of UTM, and we have to get there eventually. I don't think the industry was quite ready. Maybe some people disagree with that, but I think eventually we'll get there. And for more complex operation, it makes a lot of sense. Europe does a more complex operation where you need a standard. Well, you need the broadcast and the network. I think for most operation, they're rather simple. Broadcast is probably good enough, but we'll get there. We're an industry that's growing, and we have growing pains, and we'll go through it.
Absolutely. And as you stated, there are situations where that broadcast is going to be perfect and is going to work for the kind of stuff that we're doing today. But as we become more complicated, that network aspect is definitely something that we have to kind of keep in mind. And I want to give Brendan the last word on this question. Do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll keep it as quick as I can. Greg brought up a couple interesting points. I think there is definitely a need to protect the pipeline between hobbyists and the rest of the aviation ecosystem. I started my journey in aviation as a model aircraft hobbyist, and I wouldn't be sitting here today if I didn't have those opportunities. I would have never got into flying airplanes, and I would have never got into the drone industry. So I think there's a definite need to make sure that whatever rules we promulgate for access to the airspace, that they provide equitable access to the airspace. And I think also there's equally a need to make sure that whatever cost model that this is created under, that it doesn't set up an incentive structure for people to not use, safety promoting technologies to avoid cost, right? I think about it from the perspective of, if it cost me a certain amount of money every time I filed an instrument flight plan, then maybe that would change some pilots' behavior about what type of weather they would fly in VFR, right? Let's be honest about that. So I totally understand all of Greg's concerns. However, I am generally of the belief that transparency is typically in the public good, right? And in this case, by providing an additional layer of transparency to UAS operations, now we've improved the ability to expand those operations into the future. I mean, remote ID is the basis for certain UTM operations. I mean, this is going to be the backbone for the air traffic separation of the future. That's going to allow us to do the advanced operations like BV loss, like potentially autonomous operations in the future. So I see this as primarily a positive thing. And then I also compare it to how different is this compared to other technologies, right? We all, those of us who fly airplanes, we all have airplanes equipped with ADS-B, right? If you really wanted to track my flight, you could do that from the internet and meet me at the airport that I was arriving at and harass me there, right? So there are theoretical security implications to all of this. The question is the level of transparency that we're implementing creating more of a positive benefit than the potential security risk creates a negative benefit? And I think from what Mike has been discussing, the potential for the FAA to come up with an enforcement infrastructure or some regulations that allow protection of the crew on the ground, regardless if that's a 107 operation or a recreational operation, I think appropriately balances that need for security. And I think overall, when we look at the public good that remote ID provides, it may not be perfect, but I think the trend is in the right direction, and it's going to move us toward kind of a more integrated and closer to perfect scenario, than we were in the early days of 107 and even pre-107.
Thank you, Brendan. So Brian, I'd like to kick the question to you. We kind of been touching on this network versus broadcast, and we've kind of hinted that it's probably not going away. Since NATE specializes in the telecommunications industry, can you talk about broadcast versus network, and can you talk about ways the industry is enabling the commercial drone enterprise?
Sure. And that was a great segue into this question, Greg, that you brought up. So thanks for that. I was happy to jump in. And I'm going to pick up where you left off with UTM and moving forward. Put simply, the network is ready to facilitate this solution if the FAA did choose network over broadcast. So when that remote ID rule came out, there was only the broadcast component. There was a bit of disappointment. However, the remote ID rule, it doesn't really hurt us or help us, as the nature of our work is essentially site to site. We don't generally have two sites or towers next to each other. So from a telecoms perspective, it doesn't really change much for us right now. And I say that's important. I would say that drones were tailor-made for our industry, for tower inspections primarily. And unlike other industries like the news media, utilities, electric, our interests are primarily not horizontal, they're vertical flight. So when Part 107 came out, which enabled flight 400 feet above a structure, that was a big win for telecoms, considering we have towers ranging in height from 150 to 2,000 feet. Now, like it was mentioned before, remote ID is definitely an enabler, or a stepping stone, if you will, for beyond visual line of sight and UTM. And we are definitely not flying visual line of sight 400 feet above a 2,000-foot tower. Nobody can see that high. So the rule does have impact on how we'll operate in the future. But overall, from the telecoms, we want to promote everything wireless. As stated before, our daily activities with drones and engineering inspections and construction inspections, they're utilizing data. It's ongoing. NATE has definitely done a terrific job of forming the UAS subcommittee and bringing in the tower owners, the carriers, the telecom construction companies, operators, drone training companies, OEMs, drone software providers, brought us all together to figure out how to safely integrate this technology in and around vertical infrastructure. That's why I'm sitting here with you. The integration of drones has certainly reduced the number of climbs an operator has to make, which in turn reduces the fall rate, which has dropped off dramatically over the past 5 to 7 years, and the casualty and death rate. So drones are a great thing for our industry. They're not going to replace the climber, but they definitely reduce the number of climbs that a tower operator has to do. In addition, it allows an operator to complete work quicker at a site, reducing their time on station and allowing them to accomplish more work safely, most important, and more efficiently on a daily basis. So they're definitely enabling our commercial drone enterprises in wireless.
It's always exciting to hear, those dull, dirty, and dangerous jobs having drones as the solution there, and in such an impactful way, and saving lives in a real way.
It's huge.
Yeah. And I'm going to transition now to we were talking about the privacy and safety of the pilot. Now let's just flip that on its head a little bit. And Greg and Brendan, I'd like to kind of get your input on this. Is quite a question was asked by one of our readers, is that remote ID, is it going to help with the bad actors who violate FAA rules and regulations and cause problems for commercial drone pilots? Greg, can we start with you in that question?
Absolutely. I look at it, when you say bad actors, to me, there's two different types of bad actors. There's the pilots, whether they're Part 107 or not, that purposely go over visual line of sight, that purposely go over 400 feet, just because either they don't care. Most of them is because they decided to do this. I think remote ID will help in this case with finding what they're doing, and probably curtailing, because now it feels like somebody is watching. And I think this is good for the industry. This is something that we definitely need to work on, is educating people and making sure that they know the consequences. A lot of you are many aircraft pilots, so am I. When you're flying your aircraft, the last thing you want to see is a drone. And I know there's a lot of discussions out there. Can they really do all that much damage? We don't want to find out. And there's enough things that we have to worry about when you fly an airplane that you don't want to have to worry about a drone flying at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, or on the final of an airport. So that's the first type of bad actor, and I think remote ID will be good there. The second type of bad actor is, I would call them non-pilots. They're going to be using drones for things that as a vehicle to do damage, terrorist activity, things like that. And I don't know that remote ID will do much in this case. Obviously, we know that bad actors don't follow the regulation. Now, what this will do, though, it will help people on the ground, national security agencies, to figure out that a threat may be coming, and then be able to take it down. So that's the way I look at it in terms when we say bad actors. And then the last kind maybe is the people that just don't know the regulation. And we know there are a lot of people that just don't know the regulation. They don't mean anything bad. They just don't know what they don't know what they don't know. I love to say that term because we see this all the time. People just thinking that they know the regulation and they don't. So in this case, I think remote ID will also help. They will help the FAA to do what they do well, which is educate. And I know the FAA sometimes has a bad reputation of having a stick, but I try to tell people they don't always. I mean, if you really don't follow the regulation, eventually they'll come down, but they'll help you and educate. I'm sure Mike agrees with that part. The FAA is not always bad.
Brendan?
Absolutely. And I think, I agree with Greg on this, in that remote ID provides a mechanism for the FAA to assist in enforcement of some of the activities that are not traditionally enforceable or very difficult to enforce. When those of us who are Part 61 pilots, if you're flying an airplane and you do something stupid, that's recorded on ADS-B, and it's publicly available information, right? So the eyes are on you at all times. And does that change the way that you behave? Absolutely. One of the things that I've seen in Part 107 operations, unfortunately, because there is not a a level of risk that is comparable to manned aircraft operations, is that some 107 pilots will take additional risks up to and including violation of the regulations and do a cost benefit analysis. All right. Unfortunately, there are some people running drone businesses that look at it and they go, you know what? My likelihood of getting an enforcement action is so low, and the revenue that I'm making off of violating the regulation is decent enough that I'm just going to go ahead and risk it. And that non-compliance problem, I believe, is potentially disastrous for our industry, because unless there are some high-profile enforcement actions that kind of tamp that down, that behavior is going to continue to proliferate. And I'm of the belief that if we have a mechanism that promotes transparency and keeps everybody honest, now hopefully that behavior abates, and B, if it doesn't, we can start generating some precedent against the type of activity that is absolutely unacceptable, as opposed to what Greg was talking about, and what I would call the incidental violations. Right? Nobody's gonna revoke your license for flying to 402 feet by accident. However, if you're consistently flying beyond line of sight because it's helpful to your business, right, and you do it over and over and over again, those are the types of people that I believe enforcement action should be stepped up against. So I'd like to see that. I think that's kind of a benefit of remote ID, to get everybody on the same page and also to eliminate risk. And we have, again, this is one of the things that I promote every time I do a training course, which is that we have the potential to be the safest sector of aviation in human history. And I don't want to see bad behavior and non-compliant operations potentially jeopardize that, because the industry still has a lot of value to provide.
And David, I know I didn't slate you for this question, but how does can you talk to how this impacts the drone industry as a whole, these bad actors, and can you give us your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an issue of compliance. And overall, I think everyone in the industry wants compliance to be as high as possible. I would just say to the remote ID aspect of this, I don't think compliance will be too big of an issue moving forward. I still think with BVLOS and potentially night operations and ops over people, compliance will always be somewhat of an issue if you're operating on a very isolated site. For remote ID, I like the way that the FAA has really structured it, and that essentially by the time it's going to be required, almost all the drones you're going to be able to buy will already have remote ID implemented. So this type of bad actors and implementation will be such a big issue. Bad actors on the terrorist side and elsewhere, there has been a lot of investment by the DoD and other agencies to look into this in much more detail, and they've slated very large counter SUAS system budgets. And so hopefully they can kind of use this remote ID rules as kind of a jumping off point to safeguard critical infrastructure from those potential issues.
Excellent point. Mike, so I'd like to follow up with you on all that's been discussed and get some of your high-level view of all this. Safety is the ultimate goal of the FAA. And I think it's worthwhile to just take a step back toward the end of this conversation and look at the bigger picture of why remote ID is important for drone pilots. And in a broad sense, what ways does the new remote ID help the national airspace be safer and keep stakeholders informed? And how does this lay the foundation for follow-on rules that will enable further integration into the national airspace?
So I think that's like 14 questions.
It is probably.
No, and just sort of reiterating what all the other folks have said, that they made really great comments, and the rule is sort of designed to provide more safety and security in the national airspace, and sort of to be the prerequisite for more complex operations in the future. So that's sort of the basic answer to your question. One of the things we came up with when we were doing the remote ID Aviation Rulemaking Committee was what we call the 3 C's: the clueless, the careless, and the criminal. And as you well know, that we can regulate against the criminal, but we can't stop. If someone's going to be doing something criminal, that they're going to build their own drone, that doesn't have a system that stops it from flying if it doesn't have remote ID. But luckily, that's a very, 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 very small percentage of the operations we run into. Most of the people we run into are clueless. I mean, they don't understand the rules. They think what they purchased off of Amazon or Best Buy is a toy, and that they should be able to fly it. They used to fly their little helicopter they bought, and they don't see what the difference of this is. And so and Greg had a great example. He said he was on a forum last night or yesterday where somebody said there was a drone looking into his window. Well, this rule is for that. So, so right now, if you call the police, you call 911, the police show up, the drone's gone. What do? Nothing. And they could take a miscellaneous report, but there's no evidence of a crime. There's really no information they can follow up with. But with this rule, the people that live at that house that has a drone looking in their window can, hold up and record the fact that drone number, serial number ABC123 was outside my window. And look, my program allows me to record every time that's happened. And so they've been outside my window 6 times. Well, now that they have information they can take action on where they couldn't before. So I think it provides a lot of great information. And we've had a lot of issues with people, flying drones on approach and departure ends of airports, but by the time that the police show up, the drone's gone. And so basically there's not much action they can take. But now with the sophisticated system where we can ring an airport with sort of, Wi-Fi or Bluetooth receivers, or just the ability for that cop on his regular rounds to hold up his phone and identify that drone that could be flying illegally. I think it provides a lot more. It's going to keep our airspace a lot safer.
Excellent points. And I guess the big question is getting the technology disseminated so people know that they can use this as a tool like that. Is there any plans on doing that, or is that up to industry to get rolled out?
In some ways it's up for industry, but when we work with public safety, we're going to let them know this is something they want to probably let their communities know if it's a concern for them. We have to be very careful that we're not advertising a product over another product, obviously.
Absolutely. But good point. And so to wrap up this conversation, I'd like to ask each of you, in your opinion, what should be the key takeaway for businesses, manufacturers, software engineers, and/or pilots, depending on where your expertise is coming from, or if you're coming from all sides of that. And I'd like to kind of start that question off with Brian.
So this is a great question, and I've thought about it. I think one of the biggest things for manufacturers, OEMs, this rule coming from a regulator changes the landscape. Nothing like this from a US perspective has happened since June of 2016. I was still in the Marine Corps when Part 107 came out. And I say this because I have a point away from telecoms. We're a global company, and we have certifications within the United Kingdom that allow us to go out and deliver commercial training. And the Civil Aviation Authority, they mandate different types of training, and they make it a requirement before you can go fly commercially. And they've done this for years, and they just moved the goalpost and changed it and broke it into 2 separate training courses, which for all the training providers, like, wow, we've got to flip our model and redo it. But that's a good thing. It's a good thing because the regulator said so, which means that commercial pilots have to adhere to what the regulator says, which means they have to do something, which from a business perspective, whether you're an OEM or training provider, it's hugely important. The OEMs right now are probably like, if I would be high-fiving and going crazy because now the regulator says we have to have this broadcast module and we are required, which means I'll be able to grow my business. It's been tough over the last 4 years for everybody in the industry, whether you're an OEM, whether you're a training provider, whether you're a drone as a service company. Seen a lot of companies come and go. So to me, I give huge accolades to the FAA because now it gives companies a model to build off of and actually grow this industry. We're all looking to move the goalposts in the right direction, get to beyond visual line of sight, UTM. But to me, this is huge. In whatever way they decide, I'm all for it because I just think it helps everyone move forward.
Thank you, Brian. Excellent points, and thank you for joining the panel. David, let's go to you and get your final thoughts.
Yeah, my key takeaway is that, to kind of build on what Brian mentioned, is really the FAA with all these new regulations has really built the foundation for the industry to grow upon. doing advanced operations, doing UTM. It all kind of sprouts from here. And it did that in the way that didn't threaten what the market has already done. You know, we've seen so much great hobbyist adoption that's really spurred on. I mean, Greg mentioned this earlier in this forum, and just how so many people have been inspired by the hobbyist roots. And the original NPRM, so many people were worried about. I was personally worried about how this, you know, potential network or putting a 4G chip on every drone could impact a regular average day person's ability to have fun in the sky. And this is really safeguarding that, adding some rules to it so it's a lot more accountable, and then building the foundation for a lot of more advanced operations, a lot of interesting stuff to come down the road.
Absolutely. Mike, I'm going to skip over you so you have the last word. Brendan?
Yeah, I think that, you know, to echo what's already been presented, is regulations provide us a standard by which we can actually adopt, right? The challenge has been in the past, because there's not, I mean, looking at the parachute systems for overflight of people in particular, we spent months and months working with the FAA to figure out what impact tests need to be done, get agreement on how those impact tests need to be performed, then go spend a bunch of time and money to perform them, then to come back with a waiver application, right? All of that back and forth for a lot of these things has now gone away. We've got a concrete standard that's going to actually allow industry to follow. That's going to improve adoption. That's going to make things easier. You know, the example that I always give is if there were no federal crash testing standards for vehicles or roadworthiness standards, how would you know what car to buy? Right? If there were no RID standards or impact standards for parachutes or anything like that, how would you know what drone to build your drone program around? I mean, these are the basic questions, like David was talking about, with building the foundation for the industry to grow upon, that have to be answered, that have to be standardized, just to get everybody in industry on the same page. And fortunately, you know, to Greg's points from earlier, it looks like the FAA has been able to do this in a way that doesn't, you know, disenfranchise the hobbyist, and that's been really important to me as somebody who's had roots in that community and kind of was brought up into aviation through that community. This provides both a good framework to continue the industry's trajectory, but also without excluding anybody from the table. And it's exciting to see where this is going to go in the future. But the only way that I see it going is bigger, better, further, and faster. So I'm excited to be part of it.
It is an exciting time, and to be able to see some of those standard buildings, and I'm also looking forward to type certification. That's outside the scope of this conversation, but definitely something we're looking forward to seeing too, to continue making those standards. Greg, what are your key takeaways from this?
You know, for me, the biggest takeaway is that this is the continued proof that this is a growing industry, and from a pilot perspective, stay current, keep learning. You know, as a pilot, as an aviation professional now, this is what you do. You never stop learning. I've been teaching at the university level, at the private level for almost 20 years now, and I still learn something new almost every day, and something that I didn't know before. And I see a lot of people that try to get the certificate with the bare minimum by just passing a test. And I think this is the wrong approach in the industry. We need to learn to be proficient. I'm big on proficiency. We need to push people to learn the right way, because when you're done, your certificate, it's a license to be dangerous. That's really what it is. And now we're seeing, you know, 4 years later, 5 years later, after Part 107 was put in place, now we have a major change in regulation, and now we have to re-educate all the people that get their certificate before that. 200,000 people, that's how many remote pilots we have in the system right now. So never stop learning would be the thing that I take away from this, and continue to stay up to date with the regulation. It's going to keep changing, and it's exciting. This is a good thing. This is the proof that we're maturing as an industry. So I'm really excited about that.
Great takeaway. And Mike, I'm going to leave you with the final words. What are some key takeaways?
I think the key takeaways for businesses, manufacturers, software engineers, and pilots is that the FAA recognizes that drones are fundamentally changing aviation. You know, we realize that we're dealing with people who don't come from an aviation background typically. We're realizing that you know, people first saw these things sort of as toys, and now they need to realize that they're aircraft and that they're pilots, and they need to act accordingly. But the main thing is we're trying to make sure that we can integrate these aircraft safely into the national airspace. And that's part of what these rules are all about.
Fantastic. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. It's been a real honor to speak with you and to get your take on these new regulations. If and to our audience, if you liked what you saw today, please consider subscribing to our newsletter to get updates about what's going on at the FAA and other regulations, as well as everything that's going on in the industry. Thank you all for joining us today.